This is a video lesson about Oscar Wilde. From an historical point of view, the early Victorian period ends with the Great Exhibition of 1851 in Hyde Park and the death of Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's husband. The following decades are characterized by an increase in popularity of the monarchy because Britain continued its colonial expansion, and by the end of the century the British Empire covered nearly a quarter of the Earth's surface. The sun never sets on the British Empire became the proud vaunt of the British. Queen Victoria became Empress of India, a title that was used by the British monarchy until 1948, when India gained independence. But Britain was also engaged in many other wars, such as the Crimean War, and in South Africa the First Boer War and the Second Boer War that resulted into the conversion of the Boer republics that belonged to the Dutch into British colonies, which later took the name of the Union of South Africa. The two statements that dominated the political life in that period were William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli, who alternated as prime ministers, and who were very different in their personalities and political views. Gladstone had liberal views and was devout to the humanitarian cause, whereas the conservative Disraeli's views were imperialist and nationalistic. He was very charming, he had a very strong personality, and who influenced Queen Victoria. In the second half of the century, the Irish question grew more and more urgent and resulted into the Great Famine, when a large part of the Irish population relied solely on potatoes for food, and the blight that caused the crop to fail for several successive years brought the death by starvation for 1 million Irish people. This last part of the Victorian period saw also an increase in the strict moral codes of behaviors described by the term Victorian compromise. For example, any sexual deviance was considered unacceptable, and first of all homosexuality. In 1885, a new law was passed, the Criminal Law Amendment Act made homosexuality into a crime. Many people were put on trial and sent to prison, and this law was repealed, cioè fu abolita, only in 1967. Oscar Wilde was sentenced to 2 years of hard labor in 1952. Another famous person, the mathematician Alan Turing, was sentenced to estrogen injections or chemical castration as an alternative to prison. Oscar Wilde, his early life. Oscar Wilde was an eclectic writer. He was a playwright, first of all, but he was also a novelist, a poet, and a critic. He was of Irish origin, was born in Dublin in 1854. His mother was a poet, a journalist, and an activist for Irish nationalism. Sir William Wilde was an important surgeon, extremely fond of the folklore and archaeology of Ireland. Oscar Wilde was educated at Trinity College, and after moving to England with his family attended the Magdalen College in Oxford, where he first became involved with the aesthetic movement and became soon after its leading exponent and supporter of the motto Art for Art's sake, l'arte per l'arte. In 1879 he moved to London to develop his literary career, and he published his first collection called Poems, which received a mixed criticism. Then during his life he traveled to the United States and Canada, where he worked as a lecturer, and also to Paris. Here I have included some of the most successful quotations by Oscar Wilde. You can read them if you like. Wilde's marriage and publications. In 1884, Oscar Wilde married. They had 2 children. For them, he wrote The Happy Prince and Other Tales, The Selfish Giant. His only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, was published in 1891. He also published 4 humorous short stories in the volume Lord Arthur's Savil's Crime that included The Canterville Ghost. He reached his success, I told you, with especially as a playwright, but his first theatrical work, Salome, had to be staged in Paris because it was considered blasphemous in England. Other works, other plays include Lady Windermere's Fan of 1892, A Woman of No Importance, 1893, An Ideal Husband, 1895, and The Importance of Being Earnest in 1895. He separated from his wife in 1893 also because of his homosexuality. Aestheticism was the literary movement that characterized Oscar Wilde, who became his spokesman, his most leading figure. It developed in Europe, and particularly in England, in the second half of the 19th century, in part, as I told you in our lesson, as a reaction against Victorian age. Actually, aestheticism first originated in France in 1835, inspired by Gautier's slogans Art for Art's sake, which means art per il bene dell'arte, without any political, didactic or moral purpose. The members of the movement were very extravagant. They had a bohemian lifestyle and led a life full of excesses, but always creative in its experiences. The most important representative, as you know, was Oscar Wilde, and he had also an important influence on Gabriele D'Annunzio in Italy. Wilde aestheticism was radical. He considered the artist as the creator of beautiful things. He believed that art should be used only to celebrate beauty and the sensorial pleasures, and that life should imitate art. For Oscar Wilde, there is not an immoral book. Books are only well written or bad written, which means that vices, virtues, as well as sins, are only the material used by the artist to create his works. But the artist doesn't have any moral judgment on what he writes. Remember what I told you about The Picture of Dorian Gray. This is the figure of the dandy, personified by Oscar Wilde. The dandy is a man who uses his elegance, his refined physical appearance, clothing and language to distinguish himself from the masses as a symbol of his superiority. Oscar Wilde was a public figure at his time, extremely welcome and requested in London high society, because thanks to his brilliant and witty, che significa arguta, geniale, brillante conversation. In 1891 he started a relationship with a love affair with young Alfred Douglas, known as Bosie, and under the new Criminal Law Amendment Act he was found guilty and charged and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor. While he was in prison, he wrote a tragedy, De Profundis, and the Ballad of Reading Gaol in 1897, denouncing the inhuman condition of life in prison. When he was released from prison, he traveled to France, where he died poor, in extreme poverty, in a cheap hotel in Paris in 1900. The Picture of Dorian Gray was the first and only novel written by Oscar Wilde and published in 1891. The preface to the novel is considered a manifesto of aesthetic movement. This is an excerpt from the preface that you can read, and it's full of clever aphorisms that were used also in the trial against Oscar Wilde, the processo against Oscar Wilde, to prove his moral corruption. I want to stress the fact that Oscar Wilde was a man of contradiction. He was born in an era, in an age of contradictions, and he was a man of contradictions himself. He believed that art should not have any moral implication, but the picture of Dorian Gray is itself a powerful moral allegory. Nevertheless, it received a very negative criticism at that time, because it was considered an immoral book. Questo è the plot, this is the plot, lo leggete da soli, l'abbiamo già visto insieme. Allora, the importance of being earnest. The importance of being earnest was first staged in 1895 in a London theatre, and it became extremely successful. The play is divided into 3 acts and is a powerful satire against the corrupted Victorian society, and in particular an attack against one of its institutions, the institution of marriage, that is seen in the play as basically a tool, a means for achieving a social status. The plot, as you remember, revolves around 2 Englishmen who adopt the pseudonym of Ernest on the sly in secret. Jock Worthing, a young man who divides his life between the town and the countryside, and has invented a brother, Ernest, who lives in London, in order to have the chance to go there as soon as he wants, but also to have the chance to evade and avoid the conventions of Victorian morality and society. The false identities in the end result into a witty comedy of misunderstandings, and thanks to an original twist at the end, the play has an happy ending. Il plot ve lo lascio leggere sul libro. Ernest is a deliberate misspelling for Ernest, means earnest, honest, but the man who uses this name is not honest at all. Quindi remember, Jack is his real name. He adopted the pseudonym of Ernest. Ernest is the misspelling, cioè la variazione ortografica dell'aggettivo earnest, che significa honest. Il paradosso, the paradox, is that Jack Ernest is not earnest at all. The world described in the play is extremely artificial. The characters belong to the aristocratic society. They are extremely formal, but shallow, quindi vuoti all'interno, snobs, arrogant, only concerned with money and interested in materialistic values. The language used by Oscar Wilde is extremely effective, full of puns, full of aphorisms, and irony that achieve in the end a comic effect, because the goal, the aim, the final aim of Oscar Wilde is mocking, quindi prendere in giro, the social conventions of Victorian society. Termino con un breve riferimento a Wilde's influence. Oscar Wilde, with his eccentric lifestyle and courageous attack against the conventions of the time, became a legend, one of the most influential personalities, not only of the Victorian age, but of all times. A lot of artists and intellectuals have been inspired by Oscar Wilde. Perhaps the musician and performer who is most frequently associated with Oscar Wilde is David Bowie, because he was extremely creative on stage, and he combined aesthetic perfection in music and elegance with theatrical performance. Vi lascio una mind map che vi potete copiare e alcuni esercizi true o false che potete fare sul quaderno. Questo, infine questo esercizio che consiste nel matching the dates and events with the corresponding description. Ok, enough.